Welcome to the HR in a Box session on the topic of preventing racism in the workplace. I want to start by thanking our sponsors, the Government of Alberta's Anti-Racism Community Grant Program through Alberta Culture, Multiculturalism and Status of Women, as well as Talent Pool. My name is Bev Burke and I'm founder of Vigor Coaching and Consulting, and it is an honor to be speaking to you about preventing racism in the workplace. I also want to say thank you to the viewers for taking the time to join in and for recognizing the importance of this topic. Before we start, I'd like you to think about why this topic is important to you personally. This topic is important to me because it connected to my personal value of mutual respect. Showing mutual respect is a way to prevent racism. So please take a moment to write down a few words describing the importance to you. So let's start by talking about the session objectives. First, we're going to learn how to better support individuals impacted by encourage participation by all individuals and stakeholders who can together support anti-racism in communities and workplaces. So before we move on, please take a moment here to think about what you are personally wanting to gain from the webinar today and write it down if you could. Next, the agenda. So the topics for today: defining racism and discrimination. There is sometimes confusion or a lack of knowledge about what racism and discrimination really means. So we will discuss the definitions to provide more clarity. Next, we'll introduce the topic of unconscious bias and talk about how it can lead to racism. Given the scope of this webinar, I won't be able to go into detail about this topic, but I feel it's important to include the concept for awareness, and it is something you can explore further if you're interested. Next, I'll discuss what the Government of Alberta and the Alberta Human Rights Commission have done in recent years to take action against racism. Then I'll provide an overview of some of the important elements of the Alberta human rights laws as they relate to racism and discrimination. This will include talking about the rights and responsibilities of employers and employees, as well as reviewing some case study examples. Next, I'll talk about some examples of what some organizations have done to promote a respectful and inclusive workplace. And then lastly, I'll cover some ideas for what you can personally do to promote a respectful and inclusive workplace. So that's the agenda, and now we'll start with the first topic of defining the issue of racism at work. So this is really an issue of respect. Lack of respect can lead to racism, a lack of respect for diversity of thoughts, beliefs, backgrounds, and experiences that each individual brings to the workplace. Lack of knowledge can also lead to racism. If you lack knowledge about your coworkers and their history, how can you appreciate their unique talents? So knowledge can create appreciation and respect. In this webinar, we will talk about how you can build respect and knowledge in the workplace to address racism at work. For years now, many organizations have seen the benefits of a diverse and inclusive workplace and how it has a direct impact on the organization's success. We will discuss examples of this along with what you can personally do to encourage an inclusive culture. So let's start with some definitions, starting with defining racism. It's important to establish a definition of racism and discrimination before we can move on, so that we can have a common understanding of these issues. So the definition of racism that I've found is by Calgary Anti-Racism Education, and it states that racism comes from racial prejudice plus power. Racial prejudice is discrimination based on race. Power refers to the dominant position of a person in a hierarchy or social structure. Racism occurs when a person in a position of power is prejudiced towards someone with less power. So, for example, in a manager to employee scenario, but it can also happen in an employee to employee scenario, where the person being prejudiced feels that they have more power than the other person. So next let's talk about the definition of discrimination. So discrimination can be defined in several different ways. So this definition is based specifically on workplace discrimination. Workplace discrimination means treating an employee differently and less than others in terms and conditions of employment because of a protected ground. Race is one of the protected grounds in the Alberta Human Rights Act, and we will discuss others in the overview of human rights section of the webinar. So one great resource that I wanted to mention is for employers and employees there's educational videos that can be found under the e-learning section of the Alberta Human Rights Commission website. So the link on the slide is for Charlie's story, and I encourage you to watch this video as a follow-up to the webinar today when you have some time. But I'll tell you a little bit about it. Charlie's story shows his manager, who's in a position of power, making derogatory comments about Charlie's race and religious beliefs. This is an example of discrimination based on race and religion. There are several things that the supervisor did wrong in the video, a few being that he laughed and made fun of the Sundance religious ceremony that Charlie was coming to him and asking for time off to attend. He also called Charlie Chief several times in the video, and Charlie said that this is something that he does all the time. The supervisor also dismissed Charlie's solution, that Charlie came to him with the solution of switching shifts with another employee, Andy, even though Charlie had already discussed this with Andy and had his agreement. So in this situation, clearly the supervisor's actions tell us that he has a lack of knowledge of his responsibilities under the Alberta Human Rights Act. And that's why knowledge and education is so important to both employees and employers, and we'll be discussing this more shortly. So I want to continue with a few definitions, though, to give you a good understanding of the issue of racism and discrimination at work. So another form of discrimination that can show up in the workplace is unconscious bias. Bias is a preference for or a prejudice against a group of people. Unconscious bias is a quick judgment that is made at an unconscious level. It's how your brain categorizes people. While it's unintentional, it can impact one's behavior and how they react in a certain situation. Awareness is the greatest tool to stop unconscious bias from creating discrimination in the workplace. Many companies have started to invest in unconscious bias training to build awareness of the issue and identify ways to avoid these biases. One area in particular is to remove unconscious bias in hiring practices. So if you'd like to learn more about unconscious bias, you can read the article that I've cited there on the screen. And that's on the talentculture.com website. Next, I want to talk a bit about how the Alberta government has taken action against racism. Racial diversity in Alberta is growing. Census shows that over the last 20 years, the share of Albertans from different racial backgrounds has more than doubled. One initiative the Alberta government has undertaken in recent years involved meeting with more than 100 organizations and gathering survey feedback from nearly 1,900 people to gain a better understanding of the issues and challenges that Albertans face regarding racism. The result of this initiative are detailed in the Taking Action Against Racism Government of Alberta report that was published in June 2018. The findings in this report stress the importance of continuing to build awareness, supporting policies and laws against racism, and encouraging community groups and organizations to celebrate diversity and inclusion. And you can see the full report. The link on the screen at the bottom there is to the full report if you'd like more details. Next, I want to talk a bit about what the Alberta Human Rights Commission has done in recent years. So the Alberta Human Rights Commission also continues to proactively address issues of discrimination and harassment. And a recent example of this is the work that they did in 2017, holding meetings across Alberta to learn more about local human rights issues. Participants talked about actions taken to address human rights issues in their communities. So one action involves education, which is important to create cultural awareness and build an understanding of rights and responsibilities of human rights. Another action is empowerment. Empowering individuals and communities to address social issues and supporting and advocating for vulnerable groups is also important in addressing human rights. The Alberta Human Rights Commission has done an excellent job of providing tools and resources for employers and employees on their website. And in the next section, links to several resources are provided for your reference. So at the bottom of the screen here is a link to the full report of the findings of this study by the Alberta Human Rights Commission in 2017. So you can access that if you'd like more information. Human rights laws and overview. It's important for employers and employees to know their rights and responsibilities under the Act. This education is so important in building the knowledge that allows leaders in an organization to understand what it means to build a respectful and inclusive workplace. And I just have a link here to the Alberta Human Rights website, and I'm going to be listing as I go through this section a number of really good resources, documents, tools that can be used at work. So that's the general site, and then I'll have links to specific tools in the next little while. So when overviewing the Act, I think the one important place to start is talking about protected grounds. Acts of racism often involve any of the first 5 protected grounds listed within the Alberta Human Rights Act. So the first 5 grounds are race, color, ancestry, place of origin, and religious beliefs. In the video of Charlie's story that we spoke about earlier, Charlie's supervisor was discriminating against him based on the protected grounds of race and religious beliefs. It's important to understand that employment decisions and treatment of employees cannot be biased based on any of these 15 protected grounds. The link at the bottom of the screen here is for an information sheet provided by the Alberta Human Rights Commission that describes all of the protected grounds in more detail. So I encourage you to read that for more information. Next part of the Alberta Human Rights Act that we're going to briefly review is the rights of employees. So employers and employees have specific rights within the Human Rights Act, and it is important for the parties to fully understand what these rights entail. So employees have the right to work in a respectful and inclusive work environment free of discrimination, to be able to focus on their work and not have to deal with issues of discrimination that can make work difficult or unbearable, depending on the severity of the discrimination that they're faced with. Employees also have the right to be accommodated based on their needs relative to the protected grounds. So an example of this is Charlie's story again, where Charlie had a very reasonable request for accommodation of his religious beliefs, and yet his supervisor was not aware of Charlie's rights and the responsibilities that he had under the Act, and didn't realize that the accommodation was reasonable and valid and should have been considered and not dismissed so quickly. Employees also have the right to make a complaint if they believe they've been discriminated based on a protected ground. So this link on the screen at the bottom here is to the section of the Alberta Human Rights Commission website that details the rights and responsibilities of employees. Next, let's talk about responsibilities of employees. So employees have responsibilities under the Human Rights Act, and these include fulfilling the tasks associated with the role. Employees have a responsibility of complying with workplace rules, regulations, policies, and legislation. For example, the human rights laws, employment standards, and occupational health and safety laws. Employees have a responsibility of informing their supervisor or manager of any discriminatory behavior, whether it's directed at them or another employee. Employees can never turn a blind eye on this type of behavior, which can't be condoned. Employees have a responsibility to treat everyone that they interact with in the workplace with respect and dignity. Employees have a responsibility to make sure that they don't participate in any discriminatory behaviors based on a protected ground. And employees have a responsibility to communicate with their employer if they have a need for accommodation based on a protected ground. So now I want to review a first case study. And this case study is discrimination based on race and place of origin. So the complaint involved a woman filing a complaint that her supervisor told jokes and made comments based on racial stereotypes. She perceived that her supervisor discriminated against her because the jokes and comments were related to her race and place of origin. The employer maintained that an internal investigation in the workplace had determined that all staff, including the complainant, participated in telling jokes and making comments about the complainant's race. So this is a good example of never condoning any form of discriminatory comments, even if the employees are participating in the action. The supervisor should have been aware of his or her responsibilities under the Human Rights Act and should have stopped any of these inappropriate jokes from happening. Failure to do so is not ensuring that there is no discrimination in the workplace. So the result of this case is that a settlement was reached during conciliation. The settlement included distributing educational material about the Human Rights Commission and about discrimination to the management and staff in the workplace to build knowledge and education about the rights and responsibilities under the Act. And the link that you see on the screen there, that takes you directly to a number of case studies provided by the Alberta Human Rights Commission. So I encourage you to look at those and read. Those are good examples that you could use at work to help build knowledge and education. Next, we're going to talk about employers' rights. So employers' rules under the Human Rights Act are quite straightforward. They can run their business as they see fit, as long as they apply with all the relevant employment laws. This sounds simple, but can be complicated if they aren't aware of their rights and responsibilities under the different employment laws, which is why education in this area is so important to build the necessary knowledge. The link on the screen here is to the section of the Alberta Human Rights Commission website that details the rights and responsibilities of employers. Responsibilities of employers. The employer's specific responsibilities under the Human Rights Act involve ensuring respect, dignity, and inclusion, ensuring they are prevalent throughout the workplace for every employee, regardless of position. Employers have a responsibility for zero tolerance for discrimination in the workplace. Employers have a responsibility to remove any barriers that are based on a protected ground so that an inclusive workplace can exist. In Charlie's story, his supervisor's lack of openness to his request to attend the Sundance was a barrier based on a protected ground. And employers have a responsibility to investigate all allegations of discrimination in a timely manner. These issues cannot be delayed, they have to be reviewed and resolved quickly. So now to reinforce this, let's talk about another case study. So this is again in the same section of the Alberta Human Rights website. This complaint had a Canadian of African descent alleging that he had been discriminated against by his employer because of race and color. So he stated that during his lengthy employment, he was denied permanent status by his employer, while other employees with less seniority were not, and that despite his seniority, he was the first one to be laid off during seasonal layoffs. The employer denied the allegation, but an investigation into the matter showed his complaint had merit. So the result, the case was resolved voluntarily at the investigation stage. This case study shows that if an employer is discriminating against an employee based on a protected ground, there can be financial impacts in resolving the situation. In this case, the employee was reimbursed for lost wages, for being unjustly laid off, the seniority date of the employee was adjusted, and pension and benefit adjustments were made as well. I want to discuss a few other responsibilities of employers under the Alberta Human Rights Act. So another responsibility is extended workplace. This means that employers may be liable for behavior or actions of employees that occur away from the physical workplace, but have implications in the workplace. In my experience, this is something that isn't commonly known and can cause a lot of confusion. So an example could be a company party where an employee makes racist comments towards another employee. Other examples could involve behaviors of employees on bus trips or other company-related functions. So employers must deal with these types of behaviors in a timely manner in order to prevent racism and discrimination in the workplace. Another responsibility I want to cover is no retaliation. The Alberta Human Rights Act protects individuals from retaliation for making a human rights complaint. Employees have to feel safe to exercise their right to make a complaint or to share that they were witness to an inappropriate incident, and they can't do this if they have a fear of retaliation. This means the employer and other employees cannot retaliate against an employee exercising this right. If this happens, they could be in violation of the Human Rights Act and subject to orders under the Act. So the link on the screen is to the section of the Alberta Human Rights Commission website that details how to resolve human rights complaints in the workplace. So you can learn more about this topic there. So another case study, this one is discrimination based on race and color. So the complaint involved a woman who worked as an office clerk, complained that her manager made discriminatory comments to her and treated her differently than others because of her color and race. The allegations were investigated, and evidence showed that the complaint did not have merit. Evidence showed that the workplace was undergoing many changes, and the woman incorrectly assumed that the stress created in the workplace was because of her color or race. Evidence also showed that it was a requirement of the union contract that employees on medical leave undergo a medical exam, and that other employees had been asked to undergo a medical exam while on disability leave. This is a good example of an employee making assumptions that employment decisions were made based on her race and color, when the investigation proved that this was not the case. The result of this case is that the complaint was dismissed. There is no information in this case study indicating that the complaint was made falsely, just that assumptions were made that were found to be untrue. So the 3 case studies that we reviewed so far were heard and resolved at early stages of the investigation process at the Human Rights Commission. Now let's review a case that was heard at the Human Rights Tribunal level. This case alleged discrimination on the basis of race and color in the area of employment, and it illustrates the principle of no frivolous complaints with malicious intent. This means complaints cannot be made with no serious purpose or with dishonesty. This case is a rare situation where the complainant had to pay costs for being dishonest and misleading in the proceedings and for wasting time and resources of the parties and the tribunal. The tribunal doesn't want to discourage valid complaints and noted that this particular case was an exception to the rule. So this case is a good example, but rarely occurs. And like I said, they don't want to discourage complaints. But in this case, they couldn't accept the type of behavior that the complainant exhibited. And the case itself was between, I just put the initials of the employee there, MF, and a management services company. And if you do want to read the entire case, the link is there at the bottom of the screen. But what happened in this case, the result was actually a monetary fine towards the complainant. And it was $20,000 that the complainant had to pay to the company. So the tribunal was emphasizing again that this type of behavior cannot be condoned, and that's why this award for the company was issued. Now, all tribunal decisions released after January 1st, 2000 can now be accessed free of charge through the Canadian Legal Information Institute website. And again, that link at the bottom of the screen takes you directly to this particular case that we talked about, and you can then see any other recent cases that have been heard. So another area that speaks to race and discrimination in the workplace is Bill 30. And you've probably all heard of Bill 30, but I want to talk about it here briefly. Bill 30 is an act to protect the health and well-being of working Albertans, and it completely revised the Occupational Health and Safety Act and amended parts of the Workers' Compensation Act. The revised act and regulation took into effect on June 1st, 2018. The prior version of the Occupational Health and Safety Act also protected against discrimination, but the new version has expanded the rules that prohibit discriminatory action. It provides protection for workers from being able to exercise the rights within the Act, regulations, or Occupational Health and Safety Code without being subject to discriminatory action. The links that you see there on the screen are to resources that provide further details about Bill 30 and the revised Occupational Health and Safety Act and regulations. So that concludes our review of the laws that protect against racism and discrimination. And one way to prevent racism and discrimination is to celebrate diversity in the workplace. Knowledge of human rights laws, along with being inclusive and respecting diversity, will greatly contribute to creating high employee engagement. These actions would make any organization a great place to work. And the quote, "The more we know about other cultures, the less we'll fear," I felt really captured this point well. So next, we're going to look at some examples of what organizations are doing to promote diversity and inclusion. So good intentions alone will not create a diverse and inclusive workplace. It has to start from the top down and include strategic goals with real actions. So good intentions plus top-down support in the organization plus strategic goals related to diversity and inclusion plus real actions equal diversity and inclusion in the workplace. So the Globe and Mail and MediaCorp annually recognize Canada's best diversity employers, and the examples that follow are from the 2019 winners. And there's a number of winners, but I just selected a few to use as examples that relate to addressing racism and discrimination in the workplace. So here's what some progressive organizations have done. Air Canada collaborated with Jazz Aviation to partner with First Nations Technical Institute to help young Aboriginal students pursue their ambition of becoming a pilot. Alberta Health Services maintains a diversity and inclusion community of practice and a diversity and inclusion employee network. Chorus Entertainment, Inc. works with a number of local community organizations to support the employment of diverse individuals. Some other examples, one right here in Calgary, University of Calgary established a newcomer research network to advocate and advance research in support of immigrants, refugees, and international students. Manulife continues to encourage employees in an ongoing dialogue on inclusion through unconscious bias training. Bell Canada maintains an internal mental health policy and offers enhanced benefit coverage for mental health care. So I've been lucky, a personal example for me is I've been very lucky to work for two large companies that highly valued diversity and inclusion in the workplace. They had a dedicated diversity and inclusion manager that led initiatives for building awareness and knowledge. And some initiatives included a diversity and inclusion council with representatives from across the organization meeting on a regular basis to discuss issues and solutions to create a more inclusive workplace. We had guest speakers brought in from time to time to talk about issues of diversity and inclusion, and different celebrations were held throughout the year to celebrate multiculturalism. So my personal example on the previous slides have given good examples of what larger organizations and institutions are doing to promote diversity and inclusion. Smaller organizations and social profit groups may not have the resources to commit to creating similar initiatives, but that doesn't mean there aren't things that can be done. And we're going to talk about this next. But let's start with talking about what you as an individual can do to promote a respectful and inclusive workplace. So first, you can be an advocate for respect in the workplace. You can set the example, walk the talk, and always be respectful of everyone that you interact with. You can participate in existing diversity and inclusion initiatives and encourage others to do so as well. And if programs don't already exist, talk to the leaders about it and take the lead on taking action towards embracing diversity and inclusion in the workplace. So now some ideas for inclusive activities, things that you can do at work to promote diversity and inclusion. Now, some of these activities don't have to cost the company anything other than investment in time. So these are some good examples of low-cost inclusion activities, and they include cultural lunch and learns. So you could schedule a series of lunch and learns that celebrate a different culture each session. Have the employee present facts and stories about their cultural background and answer any questions. They can even bring in an ethnic food to share with the team. Multicultural potlucks. This is something that we did where I previously worked. You could have employees bring in a dish that represents their ethnicity to share with the team. They could even share the recipes as well. We even put together a cookbook one time and distributed it to all employees. Volunteer activities. Could coordinate volunteer days where employees can volunteer at cultural organizations to learn more about the different cultures. Another thing you could do is bring in a guest speaker for an event and to share their struggles with racism and how they overcame the adversity. Another thing that you could do is offer mandatory human rights training. And I say mandatory because in offering this training, all employees should go through it, not just select groups. And both employees and employers, of course, so supervisors, managers, the management team as well. And this would help the leaders and employees be aware of their rights and responsibilities under the law. You can also use the tools that were referenced by the links provided throughout the webinar. Those are free resources that can be accessed and shared with all employees to build the knowledge about the rights and responsibilities under human rights. So these are just some ideas of inclusive activities that can be implemented at work. If you can think of any other ideas that would work well within your organization, I encourage you to write them down now and follow up by discussing them with your leader and colleagues at work. So please take a moment to jot a few ideas down if you can think of any right now. So in summary, preventing racism in the workplace is about respect plus education plus appreciation. And this can lead to a more engaged, diverse, and inclusive workplace with no place for racism and discrimination. We all have a part in this, and I'm sure that everyone taking the time to listen to this webinar today sees the importance of having respect, diversity, and inclusion in the workplace. I encourage each of you to take a few moments following this webinar to create a personal accountability for what you can do to make a difference. Make the personal action measurable by being specific about what you will do and by when. So what you will do and by when. Include who you will follow up with at work to have conversations about this important topic. So who you'll speak to and talk to about this afterwards. Be part of this positive change that is so necessary to eliminate racism and discrimination in the workplace for good. Imagine the things that could be accomplished if we treated everyone with respect and dignity all the time. So one last thing, please take a moment to review what you were wanting to personally gain from the webinar. The goal, that was the goal that you wrote down at the beginning of the webinar. So review that, and if you have any further questions that weren't discussed, or if you have anything to add, please feel free to reach out to myself or Talent Pool at the email addresses on the slide. So thank you once again for taking the time to attend this webinar.